Hi, everyone. My name is Dora. I'm a student at NYU. Thank you for coming to the event today, Salon series, A Democrat, a Republican, and a Search for Common Ground. I'm happy to be introducing our speakers today. Jordan Blashek is a co-author of the book Union, A Democrat, a Republican, and a Search for Common Ground. Jordan Blaschick is a businessman, a military veteran, and an attorney from Los Angeles, California. Christopher Haugh is the other co-author of the book. He is a writer from Kensington, California. And our moderator is Philippa. Philippa is a social sculptor and creative strategist who produces art-field projects to spark humanizing and authentic conversations between people who might not normally meet. And so now I'd like to pass it off to Philippa, who will moderate the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora. I am so thrilled to be moderating this program. I consumed this book in just a small amount of time because I was like, every passage in it, I was underlining. So it was really exciting. And I want to start off by reading a passage that really stuck out at me. You say, we may always fear people, places, and ideas that we don't understand, but that fear shouldn't stymie curiosity. We had to see a thing to begin to know it. And in doing so, we opened our aperture just a little bit more. Fear for us had led to misunderstanding. I really want to talk about that. Like that is, I feel like is almost at the crux of this whole journey, in addition to, instilling more hope, but how do we overcome our fears? Like, and I want to add too, like I really love road trips and I've done quite a few. And recently I took one by myself and I have to admit, like, beyond the fear of talking to strangers, et cetera, like I'm a woman alone traveling around the country. And so, I'm really interested in all these kind of levels of fear that you all had to overcome to take this trip.
Philippa, thank you so much for having us, and thank you everyone who joined. The attendance is amazing, so we're so excited to get to have this conversation with you. And just to pick up on two things you said, one, I think it's worth saying just at the start that Chris and I feel so fortunate to be able to have driven across this country as many times as we did, and it struck us early on that the trips might not have been possible if we weren't two men, because the road can be a dangerous place. Like it's not always that safe. And it helped that there were two of us, but it also certainly helped that we were men. And I think people, we were more comfortable going up to strangers and talking to them than maybe we should have been. But certainly if we weren't men, and so that was something we definitely recognized a lot of privilege in being able to do that. So it's kind of worth saying that up front. But second, we also realized that we did have a lot of fear of the unknown as we went on these trips. And it really was clarified for us when we went to the southern border. We wanted to go in and out of border towns between Tijuana and Juarez, in part because the border is such a big focal point in our politics. And yet so few Americans have actually experienced what it's like to be down there. And we certainly had it. And as we went to the other side of the border, we realized like we were terrified. We had no idea what to expect on the other side. And that sense of uncertainty, not knowing what was over there, led to outsized fear. Like it just wasn't proportionate to the actual danger or to what we came to find on the other side, which was a very vibrant set of life. The towns we all went to each had amazing food. The roads were paved. Everybody was warm and welcoming. And it was our own misperception of what life on the other side of the border was like that was driving that fear. And we came to view similarly about the country that so many of our problems and differences and the ways we approach each other comes from a lack of understanding, a misperception of what the other side believes or how people live in areas we just don't know. And the beauty of a road trip is you get to illuminate some of those and get a little bit more of a sense of understanding. Chris, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. And this is going to be a great chat. But yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you started there in large part because that was kind of the central mantra of this entire project, which is, go to the scene. You can't understand something unless you see it, unless you get close to it, because then fear can't creep in so easily. And I do think that Mexico trip, and I'm glad Jordan brought that up, was an allegory for the whole project. This this whole book came together because Jordan and I were friends at law school, and we were in Connecticut and New Haven, sort of feeling like everything was changing around us. And this was in 2015, 2016. That there's the Trump movement was sort of arising. That there felt like there's this sort of liberal march to the White House on the other side of things, but we just really didn't feel like we had a full sense for where the country was. And that we were never going to get it unless we went out there and we met people and we talked to people and we went to these cities and states that we had been hearing about but hadn't really spent any time in. And only then could we start to sort of soothe the division that we felt sort of bubbling between the two of us, because Jordan's a Republican Marine, which I will say helped a lot in convincing my mom that this was a good idea to go on 6 road trips across the country to have built-in security. But I'm also the long hair coming to you from Berkeley. So we built this friendship on something other than politics, and then politics really started to get in the way. And so we wanted to go out there and we wanted to sort of alleviate this fear by going. And I think that's part of the journalist ethos too, go and see it yourself and draw your conclusions while you're there. And yeah, so yeah, I'm really glad you started with that quote. And it's fun, hearing this language again. It brings me back to the road, which we haven't been able to be on for so long.
I mean, a lot of our polarization, I think, is built on this sense of fear of each other. But, but the fear is there because we don't know each other. There's this really interesting guy named Daryl Davis who made this, or they made a movie about him, about how he went around convincing Ku Klux Klan members to give him their robes. And he did that by saying, how can you hate me if you don't know me? And so he went around saying, I want to get to know you and I would like you to know me. And that's how he dissipated the fear. So I think about that a lot. And I think about what you all did. And I've traveled around myself trying to do the same thing, but how not everybody, again, has the privilege to be able to do that. Not just because they're white or they're men or whatever, but because who has time to be driving around the country? Or for me, I was lucky and I had somebody gave me a grant to do it. So yay. How do we help people get to know each other, when we are kind of stuck in our geographic bubbles and silos?
Yeah, our grant when we first set out was extended to us by Chase Bank and Wells Fargo. It was all credit cards for us when we first got started. But yeah, I know, and we were really fortunate that we met when we did, and we had this moment in our lives when we were able to get together and go out there, and we could take exams from the road and work calls from the road, and we were very fortunate in that way. But yeah, I think that I totally lost my train of thought there. Sorry, what was your question again? Can you repeat?
What can people, normal people, ordinary
Yes,
people know?
sorry. Yes, thank you very much. My God. Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I think is really important is that when we've been on this book tour, talking about this book, and sort of from the very beginning when we started to tell people that this is what we were up to, remarkably, instead of kind of getting people going, wait, you're spending that much time with a Republican or you're spending that much time with a Democrat, everyone we talked to, almost to the person, said, oh my God, I can't wait to read this, or you got to tell me what you've learned because my cousin believes something, who I grew up with believes something very different about politics and has driven us apart. Or, I grew up in a conservative family and now I work entirely with more liberal leaning people. And I would really like to learn a language to talk about these issues instead of ignoring it. And so I think that, Jordan and I brought it to the surface by going on these road trips and really embracing it and doing this kind of special thing. But I think everyone has those little, interaction points with the other side. And so embracing that and not being afraid of it, I think, is part of this. And oftentimes that piece is available in our families, where it's almost unavoidable. I mean, I know a lot of people are dreading Thanksgiving because we're either going to be on a Zoom together or we're going to be around a table with people who we can't avoid talking politics with. And so I think if we can learn a language to lean in on that, that's one way of handling this. But now that I'm back in, Jordan, what do you think?
Well, I think the other way is through storytelling, and I think journalism is a really powerful way to show people what life looks like for others who they might not know or understand. I actually think novels are a really beautiful way of doing it because it lets you into a different kind of person's emotions and thoughts. And I think to the extent we can, being humble, open-minded, and really seeking out people and experiences who are different from us, either through documentaries, literature, art, etc., is the best way to really get introduced to that. And then, where possible to travel, even if it's just locally. I think one thing I'm always amazed by is I grew up in Los Angeles. You go 20 minutes outside the city and you feel like you're in a different world. Like everybody owns guns, everybody is driving trucks. It's just very different. And the same is true outside New York. The same is true outside Chicago. You don't have to go too far to get an experience of something very different to what you see day to day. I just highly encourage people to do more of that.
So happy you said that, because that's another passage that I was so excited when I read your book. It says, let me just read it out real quick. It says, we had both come to believe that art, culture, and music were the best way to convey the complexity of who we are, where we've come from, and where we may be headed. Perhaps that was why we were turning away from politics. In 2019, it was bereft of what really mattered: honesty, dialogue, and nuance. I was like, oh my God, like I could have written this book, y'all, like seriously. Because that's sort of my wheelhouse of like, how do we use art as a way to not only spark conversations and frame conversations, but to build empathy. And I think that's what you're talking about, Jordan, is like, how do we build empathy through the arts? And also, that section where the guys in prison are doing those Shakespeare plays and like talking about how they were learning about themselves and how they were learning how to move through the world and redemption. It was so beautiful. So anyway, I could just be very effusive and go on and on, but I really, can we talk a little bit about, a little bit more, dig in more about like how we can build more empathy through the arts and through these kinds of conversations, and why that's important to build the empathy.
Yeah, well, you're the expert on this, so we'd love to hear your take on it. But I think that insight hit me and Chris like a lightning bolt, and it was something we just kind of stumbled upon. Like throughout our journeys, we kept seeing evidence that music and art had this power to bring people together, but it never was forefront in our minds. And independently, we just love New Orleans, and we kept going back to New Orleans because it was a city that the two of us just found sort of like a special meaning for our friendship. We wanted to go there over and over again. And it was on our last trip in New Orleans that this musician said something to us that was the lightning bolt. And he said that, our politics is dualistic. It's you're on this side or you're on that side. There's only one way to approach it. And as a result, it puts us into this sort of antagonistic mindset where it's like you versus me. But there's nothing dualistic about art and music. You can approach it from a million different directions. You could have your own interpretation. It speaks to you in its own unique way. And it allows us to engage in a way that is positive sum. It's expansive. Anyone can bring their interpretation. And that really hit us. Like, why do we get fixated on the politics side of life, where we're destined to fight? Like, we're always going to fight. And there's no way we can reach kind of these like greater understandings of each other and develop empathy in the politics mindset. But in art and culture, we could. And, we can wrestle with deep, hard problems of, history and identity in a way that like didn't lead to antagonism, but actually led to empathy and understanding. And, we came to that realization, but we're not artists. And so I'd love to hear your take on how that's possible and how art actually leads to empathy.
I mean, you literally hit it all on the head. I mean, it's like you could have, that's the speech I always give, but I also think about how, there's some social science research that talks about how art can create a sense of awe and wonder in people. And when you feel more awe and wonder, you feel more curious. And when you feel more curious, that creates a greater sense of empathy. It makes you feel more part of like the fabric of humanity. And so there is a direct line between art and empathy that we need to like strengthen. We need to be putting that out there even more. And I was thinking about that trip to New Orleans too, because I really love Jazz Fest as well. And I was thinking about jazz, like not only as an American art form, but also it's so complex and there's so many different ways of literally playing that music. And it just, to me, embodies what the complexity and nuance of our humanity literally in the music itself. So anyway, I just love, again, like.
Oh yeah, and I mean, jazz is so incredible for so many reasons, like not least of which is like, it was, I think I hope I'm not wrong saying this. It's like the first truly unique American art form. or musical form. And it also combines, I think, so many of like the things we prize as Americans. It combines like just genius and creativity, like individual excellence, but like in a team effort. You know, you can have your individual identity, but still come together to create something that's like more than the sum of the parts. And yeah, I mean, Jazz Fest is amazing. I think Chris and I are devastated that we couldn't go this year. But yeah, I think there's just something so beautiful about how, you know, whenever you hear music emanating from a stage, like everybody just naturally kind of like congregates together, and you subsume some of your individualism into kind of the broader collective. And anyway,
yeah. If I could jump in on the layered point too, I think music also keyed us in on one of our major final conclusions. And in some ways, our book concludes like 3 different times. You know, it starts to conclude in New Orleans, and it continues concluding into Tulsa. But you know, one thing that we were struggling with is how do you capture both optimism and excitement for the future with a potentially difficult past? How do you put tragedy next to triumph? And when you're in a conversation, when you're debating policy or any sort of the big political issues of our day, it's very hard to sort of to thread that needle. But in music, it like Jordan was saying, like it lives naturally next to one another. You know, tragedy and triumph, hope and misery in some cases. And I think that was when we really started to say, look, these ideas and these feelings are not contradictory, or they're not mutually exclusive. You know, they can inform one another, and they can lead to one another. And we found that only in art, and in many ways it soothed our own relationship. I mean, whenever we had our worst fights, and I think this is another big point that we try to get across in the book, is that common ground isn't easy. You know, Jordan and I still fight to this day, less and less, I hope, and more respectfully. But you know, we still get in dust ups, and some of the best ways of getting over that and summoning the grace to say, I'm sorry, or you know, I love you, man. Let's continue this journey. Is like you say, experiencing the awe, experiencing the wonder of whether it's music or art, or even the sort of sublime views of nature. I mean, when you're on the road, it almost feels like looking out over Mono Lake is akin to listening to a symphony or going to a jazz concert. There's something deeply akin there. And so that's sort of what sort of started to say, okay, maybe we don't have to look at this country as all bad or all good. And it was in music that let us say, you know, let's play in that gray space.
Yeah, that's right. I'm so torn right now, because I want what you just said about holding the past and the present together is something I want to talk about. But I want to pull one more thread before we get there. And I'm not ignoring you, Christopher, but I got to ask you this, Jordan. One of my favorite parts about the book is like how much you appreciate Mexican culture. And you were in a dance club or something like that. You're really into to dance, and I thought that was really neat. And in fact, I wore my Mexican shirt. I bought a shirt in Mexico.
Oh, I love that.
Last year, in your honor. And I was thinking about your appreciation for that culture. And the woman that took care of you as a child, she's Guatemalan, right? Yeah. Anyway, I was thinking about, I have to ask you this, like, you know, when you heard Donald Trump call Mexicans rapists and bad people and murderers, like, what did you think? Like, did that feel personally offensive to you at all?
That's a great question. So I think I've always loved Mexico as a kid. I grew up in Southern California, so my family would often go down there. But it really wasn't until 2017, 2018 that I really started developing kind of like a love for the culture. It started with a trip I took in business school. There were 5 Mexican students in the class ahead of me, and they organized a trip throughout the entire country. So from Tijuana to Mexico City, San Miguel de Allende, down to Oaxaca, and we drove most of it. And seeing all the different states and the differences across their culture, and the different food varieties and the music, and just the way people live was really incredible. And so after that trip, I started going like almost every few months down to Mexico. And Chris and I went twice just south of the border together. And so I really developed a love for it. So that came after that comment. Though, thinking about that comment, this was one of Chris and my bigger fights in the book. In chapter chapter 5, we actually started arguing about that. And, I think there's no defense for his words. I think his words were deeply offensive, and uh, I'm not like willing to defend them. I think in the context of our fights, my point to Chris was he said it in a very like uncouth way, but I didn't interpret it as he was applying it to all Mexicans. I think he was saying specifically there are bad people coming across the border, and we need to stop those people. But it doesn't mean all people crossing the border are bad. And so in my mind, I was able to interpret those words with that split. Chris felt differently, and as a result, we ended up having a sort of all-out fight about it. But that was sort of my feeling, is it was not meant as like a broad brush across the entire Mexican people, and was specific to like, there are bad actors coming across the border, and that has to stop. So that was how I parsed it in my mind.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I do like that part, when you go to the Trump rally and you actually hear people trying to have little civil conversations with each other. And that's not what's reported. That's not what we hear in the media. And so I thought that was really interesting, because a friend of mine wrote a book called Liar's Circus, and he went around to all the Trump, a bunch of Trump rallies and wrote a book about it. But he focused on, the real kind of weirdos that are always at weird, things like that. And so it was very sensationalistic. And I recognize that because, I have experienced that. But somebody reading that doesn't see all the nuance. So I think it's really important for people like us to be really out there talking about those nuances. Maybe that's like how we get the message out for people who can't take the road trip together like this and who can't go around the country. We have a big responsibility because we are able to do this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, Chris is the journalist, so I'm curious what he would say about this. But I think one thing that stuck out to us at the Trump rally is there were cameras everywhere, like both in the rally and outside, and they were always pointed at the most aggressive, intense protesters or supporters, and they would zero in on like scenes of conflict. And all around them, there were scenes of civility, people having normal conversations, people like being nice to each other, treating each other well. Or advocating for their side, and passionately but respectfully. And it was a shame that all of that got missed. And so it reinforced to us that conflict sells, partisanship sells. Of course, the media is going to focus there, and just sort of howling about it is not the answer. I think the answer is creating things that are beautiful, that can break through and still attract people's attention, and show them that there is another side going on.
Yeah, if I could jump in just really briefly on this point, this is a time-honored issue in journalism. I mean, there's the old expression, if it bleeds, it leads, or you never see a headline of the Times saying, 1,000 planes land safely at JFK. There isn't the same sort of sensation or excitement or news value to things going as they should potentially. And I think that's a question of medium, though. I mean, something that we noticed is that these cameras were, cable news cameras, or these cameras were nightly news cameras that only had a 3-minute segment. They don't really have a lot of time and space and to meditate on an issue, or to write a story that transcends one rally, or is maybe complementary to the camera that's whipping around to the most kinetic moments. And so that's another reason why I try to plug, local news as much as possible, and long form news, and the importance of having a diverse media diet where it's not just nightly news, or it's not just cable news. It's you're taking in magazine work, and you're taking in local NPR stations, or whatever it needs to be, because we were there too, and we were journalists in that instance, and we came back with that story. But we didn't jump on cable news that night. We wrote for a year and a half and then put it out later. And so that's the importance of a diverse, ecosystem, is that you get those sorts of different beats. Does that mean that all is well in the cable news sector? Absolutely not. But it does mean that if you're looking more broadly, you have a better chance at sort of seeing the whole picture.
I would like to take this moment now to go on my rant that I always go on, because I'm really angry about the polarization industrial complex, and how there's power and profit to be made in keeping us polarized. And kind of just what you're talking about, like, if it bleeds, it leads, like that, it gets more clicks, it gets more eyeballs. And so I'm really frustrated about that, because I know for a fact that most Americans just are sick and tired of the narrative around polarization, and they actually want to talk to each other. And we have to, like, I'm really frustrated because I really want to do something about that. And I think like I said, I think part of it begins with people like us telling these different stories that we're seeing face to face, in face to face conversations, unfiltered by media. So let's do that. There's a bunch of questions coming in, and I'm seeing them, but I'm so excited about talking to y'all, but I also want to like keep integrating. So everybody keep asking your questions. And there's one that I think is kind of probably appropriate for this moment. Somebody is asking, you know, how do you think we deal with misinformation and disinformation? Because, you know, there's one layer of us trying to tell real people's stories, but then there's just a whole other layer of like actual misinformation that's being put out there, and disinformation. What do you all think about that?
Well, I'll start, and then we'd love to hear from Chris. I think we might actually disagree on this. I don't know. We'll see. I love when we disagree. It's rare these days.
Right.
So I think my view is that we need to start by being very clear about what misinformation and disinformation mean. Because I think what's happened over the last 4 years is that different sides use it to suit their own agendas. And as a result, they're becoming muddled. And as they get muddled, it's very easy to dismiss what the other side is saying. And now all of a sudden we're locked into political warfare over the words themselves. So, you know, just as an example, and I think this has come up actually in recent days on Twitter between like left and right, you know, is misinformation lying about the facts? Like, is it saying things are true that are not actually true? Or is it, well, the facts might be right, but the narrative it implies is wrong, or we don't like the narrative. So being very clear on like what is misinformation, what is disinformation, I think is the basis for like any kind of solution coming out of it. And so I think we need to figure out a way that we can begin to agree on like what is the definition, be crystal clear on it, so that we can then say, okay, this falls in the category, this doesn't fall in the category, and therefore we know what to do about each of those. At the moment, because it's so muddled, I think it makes it very difficult to actually have productive conversation or solutions around it.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree at all. I think that social media, and maybe someone on the call, on this Zoom will disagree if they work in the field, but I think they just started getting interested in this topic, and I think they might be making a lot of mistakes because they're new to it. And I think that Jordan's absolutely right. I think that we need to care deeply about what the difference is, and what this all means, and how to police it, and when to police and when not to police. I mean, we all believe in the marketplace of ideas, right? So that, you know, the best ideas win out because someone says it more intelligently, and then we all say that's the right way to go. But on the not on the question of scale, but on the question of friendship, I mean, I think one of the best ways that I've had towards dealing with misinformation and disinformation is Jordan, who's over here on my screen, if you know, wherever he is, because like having someone who brings to you different information, different ideas, different sort of first principles, who's able to say, I don't know about that, when you're saying something that maybe you've read online, they're willing to check you. That's one of the best opportunities to say, I know what I'm consuming, and I know that it's correct. Because if you surround yourself by like-minded people, it's a great thing. I mean, it feels comfortable. We all want community. We all are tribal in some way, shape, or form. And the world feels small in a good way. But if you don't have friends who are going to contradict you or are going to push you in your thinking, then that small world is going to be just that, small. And Jordan makes the world bigger. And that can be intimidating and scary, but at the same time, it can also make things much more clear. It can be clarifying. And so I think having friends and people in your life who are willing to check your worst instincts at times is really helpful and really powerful. And the last thing I'd say again is that goes to the diversity of news again. You know, you need to be taking in as much as you can from as many different sources that you trust. You're right, with an underline on trust. But yeah, I'd say Jordan is my biggest misinformation fighting mechanism. So thanks, boss.
I think that's exactly right. Like you know, this idea of geographic sorting and just the sorting of people in general it's a real thing, like our little silo that we talk about a lot. And so we don't have a lot of diverse friends. And a lot of times when we talk about diversity, we're talking about racial diversity, but really we really do not have political diversity. I live in DC where it's 93% of the people voted for Biden. And I have to really struggle to find friends who think differently from me. So I really like that point. I hadn't really thought about that. Like one way to fight disinformation, misinformation, or to define what information is to literally have people who are thinking differently than you. So I thank you for that a lot. Okay, but I still struggle with it though, because when we have a president who's shouting fake news all the time at everything just because he disagrees, I'm not asking you to defend the president. It's just very hard when people, he's the president, so people are following what he says and they listen to him. Is that can we turn that boat, in the next administration? Or are people just gonna keep on shouting fake news?
Well, I can start here. I might be in the minority on this, but I think this is a problem that existed well before Trump. I think trust in the media had been eroding enormously over time, and that's a technology story. It's an internet story. I think journalists all have to look inward as well as to how we got to this point where certain diseases are more popular than aspects of the media. When you poll, favorability, we're right down there with Congress, right? Journalists. And I think that transcends the Trump moment. And do I think Trump helped? Absolutely not. But I think this was a trend line that was going downward for a very long time. And I think it's going to take far more than just the change of presidency to begin to address it. And again, like this is why I always try to plug like local news. Like still to this day, more essential news is created by local news outlets than any other news medium out there. I mean, it's enormous, the percentage that comes out of these local newsrooms, which are sometimes just one man or woman who is both the editor-in-chief, the beat reporter, and the business side director. And so I think it's about buying news. It's about caring about journalists again. And I think that's certainly gonna the long tail of the fake news moment will continue to compound that effect. But I mean, this started in the 80s. This has been going for a very long time.
But don't you think journalists have a responsibility too? There's a great piece I read recently by Amanda Ripley, and she talks about like how journalists need to write stories differently and how journalists need to integrate more nuance into their writing, because it's partially journalists' responsibility to present the nuance as well. It's not, it's not up to us to figure that out. How are we supposed to find out? We're relying on you.
Right. No, I think that's absolutely true as well. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for the beat reporter out there who, has taken 10% pay cuts since 1999 or no longer has a job. But you're absolutely right. And I think there's two forces going on. I think there's this sort of longer term tectonic, changing of our news media that we've been discussing, technology, et cetera. But then I also think there's a lot of new voices coming into the media. And I think that's going to be our savior. I think the fact that journalists are starting to look like America in a big way is going to both disrupt things, which is going to cause some problems, but then ultimately is going to be what saves journalism. It's going to allow us to say, okay, the ways of the past aren't always working. Let's hold on to what matters, and let's build a new way of discussing the 21st century. And I think that sort of innovation, that entrepreneurial moment in news is going to be huge for all journalists. And we're all gonna have to adjust though. We can't just rely on the Watergate moment. Everything we learned from All the President's Men. I mean, it's going to look a little bit different. The next All the President's Men, it's going to look a little bit different. Yeah. And I'm reading Catch and Kill right now, and it's looking a little different than All the President's Men. It's going to continue to go that way.
Yeah. People are asking more great questions about this, so I'm just going to keep going on this flow if you don't mind. And Jordan, I don't know how you're doing this, but thank you, because that More in Common study is exactly the study that I was going to mention about how I know that most people want to have these conversations. So thanks for mentioning that. It's called The Hidden Tribes. I really recommend looking at that study. I also, Marcia Friedrich, watched that movie Social Dilemma and thought about, the sort of manipulation of our psychology that's being done by social media. Like, you know, we can go on and on about how journalism needs to change, all these things. And then here we are just being pawns in this greater capitalist system of psychological manipulation for profit. And I should just say that I love capitalism, so that's not my problem. My problem is, you know, being used as a pawn for somebody else's magnificent wealth gain. Did you all see that movie? And what do you think?
Jordan did. I might let him field this one.
Yeah, I mean, that freaked me out a lot. I think that the key phrase in the movie that stuck out to me, and I just haven't been sleeping fitfully since I did, is Tristan Harris says, we were so focused on when AI would beat human strengths that we forgot that, or that we ignored when it overtook human weakness. And I think it's so true. And that's what social media is doing. It's playing on all of our weaknesses, and it's driving up anxiety, depression, anger, hatred, et cetera. And those are, you know, the weaknesses that we spend lifetimes trying to cultivate away from. And I think in some sense, it's very similar to when supermarkets came out, and all of a sudden you have these huge marketing teams trying to figure out how to get you to consume, you know, junk food and you know, cereal that was going to be bad for you. And we saw skyrocketing obesity in the US, and it's taken us almost 30, 40 years. Jonathan Haidt from NYU talks about this. It's taken us 30, 40 years to figure out how to adjust our eating habits and health habits to like deal with the fact that we just didn't understand how this was playing on our brains. And social media is doing the same thing, just almost in a supercharged fashion, because you have supercomputers pointing at you, just figuring out exactly how to like overcome your specific weaknesses. So it's very dangerous. I think we need to accelerate the process of like learning how to cultivate awareness of what it's doing to us, cultivate like better practices and habits, and take control of social media. So, you know, individuals should be tailoring their own feeds to enhance the qualities they want, not to lead them to bad behavior. So, you know, only follow people who you think, you know, cultivate the best in you. Tailor Instagram so that it feeds you positive images and scenes of nature or puppies to make you happy. But like everybody needs to, I think, get much more active, because we don't have 30, 40 years. If we wait that long, I think that's the end of civilization.
Yeah, I think that's right. But it is really hard. I mean, we're battling, you know, our deepest inner psychology. I've thought a lot about Jonathan Haidt and how he talks about like we're not even aware of like what's happening, you know. So it's very hard to go against our inner humanity that we're not even aware of. So anyway, I mean, I agree with you, Jordan. I just want to acknowledge how hard that is to do. And you know, anyway, I'll just let that go because I'm very frustrated.
Well, and this is a callback to how you opened this conversation too, and how we were hoping to get out on this book tour and say, go to the scene, you know, go see it for yourself. You know, it's so distortionary online right now that really the only way to know, you know, how truckers feel about politics, or you know what it's like to pull a lobster out of the ocean. Like, these are things that Jordan and I went out and did and got a chance to do, and you can't know it until you see it, or until you start reading deeply about it in a way that isn't just like a 2-minute segment or a 30-second video online with a hashtag. So yeah, I mean, and it's too bad we can't do it as easily right now.
Yeah. I mean, experience is such a powerful way to learn, you know, beyond just reading. I mean, I love, you know, reading and all the things, but when you experience it, it's really powerful. Yeah, anyway, I agree. My dear friend, Selena Gerbic, who lives here in DC, she's on the call. She's on our Zoom today. You know, she was, I don't know, she's pulling out another little thread about like, I mean, it's one thing to have lots of friends who are, you know, different from you and trying to learn from them. But I don't know, there's still this moment when she gives the example of a friend of hers who believed that the Lincoln statue had been beheaded and defaced by, I guess, probably BLM people or, you know, some lefty crazy liberals. And so she said she had to jog down to the Lincoln Memorial and take a picture to prove that it had not been beheaded. what do you, I don't know, like, I, I hate to keep harping on this, but I think it's important that we figure out a way to address this issue, because we're not always going to be able to give that kind of proof to show like this did not actually happen.
Well, I don't have any like grand solutions. Maybe Chris does. But one way on a micro level to address this is there's studies that show that if you actually put skin in the game, any kind of stakes, people's like crazy opinions dramatically like shrink to much more sane, moderate opinions. So even in that very simple example, I'm just curious if the person had said to their friend, well, I'm willing to put $100 on the fact that the Statue of Liberty or the Lincoln Memorial hasn't been defaced. Will you put the same, or even make it 10 or whatever? But once there's skin in the game and people actually have to back up their crazy opinions, they dramatically moderate like what they believe. And so that like simple trick alone, just putting some money on it, actually helps a lot.
That's pretty good. I'm gonna try that.
We should have gambled more on the road, Jordan.
Yeah.
We've missed opportunity here. Well, can I also say, like, I think your friend is actually exhibiting exactly how to deal with it, which is like leaning into it. And I would underline the word, she has a friend who does this, like leaning into the friendship side of this. I mean, we like to say the Common Ground is a project, that it is our project. It's not our only project. It's a project that we think more people should engage in, but it is not the be all end all for citizenship. Talking to Republicans, talking to Democrats is not the beginning, the middle, and the end of what it means to be American, say. And we would not expect anyone to feel forced to go explain themselves or go find a friend from across the aisle. But I think there is something noble, I hope, about engaging in that. I mean, she ran down to the mall to take a photo to convince a friend that this thing is not true. And that's really, it's opting in, it's putting in the time, it's coming back to the table. It's not saying reading that text and going block. It's reading that text and running down. It's like putting effort in. And I think that really matters. And I mean, I think that's what Jordan and I learned. I mean, we were fortunately in a car, so we couldn't get away from each other sometimes. So we had to keep engaging. But that lesson really stuck with us, that you can't just give up, especially if you care about this. And you got to keep listening. You got to keep trying. And I think that's the way to do it. And I know that's not necessarily scalable. We're hoping it may be scalable, but I think that's really the only antidote here.
I could not agree with you more. And it really frustrates me. Like even in an election when, well, at least this time more people showed up, but when, in 2016, when 100 million people who could have voted did not vote, just is so frustrating. Like they couldn't even do the barest engagement in our civic life. And, so anyway, I really hope that we have to engage, like we have to try. And so many people aren't willing to, and I get it, fear, all the things, but our democracy relies on this, depends on us trying.
Amen.
Yeah. And, so, and actually on that note, somebody was asking, how, the kinds of things you talk to with the lobsterman, the long truck driver. Maybe we could talk a little bit about how to have these conversations. What kinds of questions should we ask? I feel like it's not just the who, what, where, when, how interrogation that, I hate it when I'm interrogated by people who think they're asking me meaningful questions. Like, how do we have real conversations? What do you guys think? What did you learn?
Well, great question. I think what we learned from both those two men, the long haul trucker and the lobsterman, was that it really helps to not talk about politics for a little bit and to get to know someone on a very personal level. We spent 5 days in the cab of the truck with Pete, and we talked about everything from where we grew up, our families, our personal histories. We had meals together. We drank coffee together at 4 a.m, and all of those little experiences helped us when we did get to politics, that we had this deeper level of understanding and empathy. It made more sense where his political views came from. Pete, the long haul trucker, was particularly interesting because he wore a Make America Great Again shirt the entire time. And yet his political views were all across the board. He supported gay marriage. He hated that the president wouldn't talk about climate change. But he also had some more conservative views on things like the use of taxes and regulations. He hated that he felt like the government was always sort of watching him and criminalizing different activities on the road. And so it really helped to get to that nuance that we did spend time together over meals and we did talk about our personal lives. Similarly with Willis, the lobsterman, the only reason he even opened up to conversation with us is that we spent a whole morning and afternoon helping him with repairs on his boat, and not talking about politics, and asking more about the industry and how he came up in the industry, how he learned to be a lobsterman, and the different trials and tribulations of that profession. And only later got to some political issues. So I do think the real key is to have these conversations in intimate settings, to build up trust just through normal social engagement and interaction. People want to connect when you just talk about the normal things of life. People want to connect, and really wait until you have some of that understanding and trust before trying to enter into more troubled waters.
Totally. In all the conversations I organize, I actually specifically tell people when you arrive, like, you're not allowed to talk about politics until I tell you can talk about politics, because you have to build relationship first. You have to build trust first. And, why should I talk to you about something that I feel very vulnerable about when I don't even know you, so I need to know you first. So I think you guys totally did exactly, I think, naturally what that you had to do. Can you speak more? Speak more to genuine curiosity. Well, I'll speak to it first because this is something I care about. It's like, I feel like a lot of times when I tell people I organize these kind of conversations, they're like, oh, "What do they say?" Or what, they act like it's some kind of zoo, or or like a fetishized kind of, like those weird people who are conservatives over there. And, I really try to emphasize, like, no, I'm genuinely curious. Like, I really want to know. And so, how can we cultivate more sort of genuine curiosity? Like, these are, people. We need to cultivate our humanity first before we can start asking these kind of questions about politics.
Yeah, sorry, I just had a dog jump up in my lap, so I apologize oh, hey. Yeah, I think it's so critical to be genuine in that endeavor. I mean, if you're not genuine, then you're going to get sniffed out immediately. I mean, that was like something that we had to learn. I guess not the hard way, but this ended up being a project of engagement. We would roll up our sleeves and do things. Whether that was with Willis, the lobsterman. He didn't really want us to take us out onto the water and tell us about his life until we actually showed that we were willing to stick around and be in the sun and help him screw something into the hull of his ship and express our genuine interest in his life and who he was. And as a journalist who aspires to just sit against the wall and take notes and kind of disappear, it was hard at first for me. But I learned the power of that. I mean, you need to express your humanity before people will talk to you and before they'll tell you their deepest, darkest secrets. And I think that I learned it more quickly with Jordan, in that whenever I was acting as a type, like, I'm going to fly the Democratic flag and I'm going to convince Jordan of his incorrectness, then we never got anywhere, and I never learned anything, and I certainly never convinced him of anything. But when we were able to have genuine dialogue, that was where we really were able to open up and to not be a Democrat and Republican, but to hear about Jordan's Marine service and to tell him about why I chose to be a journalist from the age of 17 onward. That's when we were able to actually engage and learn and find out that we're not all that far apart. I think that's the maybe the first starting point, is that what divides us is not as strong as what holds us together. And I think if you come into a conversation with that in mind, then you're going to have no choice but to be genuine in your curiosity. Because where are those? Where is that tissue? So that's what I'd say. Jordan, what do you think?
I agree with that totally.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like lately it seems like your political standing is more important than the 40 other things that are more interesting to me than you. Like, you're a musician, you're a Marine. Those things, like, how did politics become the most important identity to around us? I think it's so boring. When I love politics, I love talking about politics all the time, but that is not the most important identity that I hold. So we need to, like, lift up those other ones.
Yeah, so you just captured, I think, one of our like biggest takeaways from the book, which is that Chris and I were always able to have better conversations when he looked at me as a Marine and I looked at him as a journalist, because there's nothing dualistic about those identities. Like me saying that, I really love this country because I have friends who went overseas who wore the flag on their shoulder and they died for this country, and the things that the great values that it represents. Nothing about that is sort of in opposition to Chris's worldview as a journalist, and vice versa. I could understand why Chris would say, let's not make judgments. Let's go see it for ourselves. And what we took away was that being able to speak from other identities meant we could have much deeper, richer conversations. And we do feel that, at the end of the day, nobody views their political identity as their most important identity. No one's like, well, I appreciate being a Democrat more than I do being a son or a parent or a mother or a member of a certain community. Those are the things that I think really speak to us at a deep level. It's like the equivalent of the eulogy virtues that David Brooks talks about, where, at the end of your life, like, you don't want people talking about, oh, he was a great Republican. You want people to talk about, you were a great friend and family member and a member of the community. And so, holding on to those deeper identities. And when you do engage with someone, thinking about, well, what are the identities that this person might prize that I'm overlooking because I'm simply focused on the fact that they support Trump or Biden? I think that really helps foster a much healthier dialogue.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. Ruben actually asks a question that it's adjacent to this that I want to pull out too. He's asking, of the formal groups that are dedicated to cross-party communication, what proportion originate with conservatives and what proportion with progressives? And I do want to kind of focus on that. And again, not ignoring you, Christopher, but Jordan, when I started organizing my dinners just around my dinner table before it grew into a national project, I had liberal people banging on my door asking to come to these dinners. Like hundreds of people wanted to join who were, more on the liberal side. And I mean, maybe, partly because that's more of my circle too. But it was so hard to get conservatives to come to these conversations, so hard. Even after years of doing it, after I told people, that they knew that I was being, creating a sense of balance and fairness. I don't see a lot of conservatives leading the charge to have these kind of conversations. That's, again, anecdotal. Maybe you're seeing it more. I don't know, what's your experience around that? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Great question. So I'm going to muddle through this a little bit, but I think it's worth dividing into some categories. I think the groups themselves, groups like Braver Angels and More in Common and a few of these groups, the few studies I've seen on actual group participation, it does seem like it tends to be a majority, and not a huge majority, but a bare majority, liberal to conservative. I think it's interesting to try to think of why that might be true. A lot of them are often founded by a conservative and a Democrat together. And that's sort of the founding story. And then the majority tend to be a little more Democrat. I think on the actual participation among just ordinary people, my theory on this would be that over the last 4 years, especially in major cities, but probably across the board, that there's a feeling on the conservative side that they often get demonized for their views in a way that doesn't necessarily happen in the reverse. So you can be pretty extreme liberal, and those views are generally tolerated. Whereas if you're extreme conservative or even just moderately conservative, you probably worry about being excluded or being outcast. And so I think that difference in demonization leads to what I believe is actually fairly rampant on the right, which is preference falsification. People don't fully say what they believe because they're worried about being outcast for their views. And I think that also leads conservatives to avoid being in positions where they would have to talk about things they believe. Even me, I am probably as moderate and center right as it gets. And even I am sometimes worried about expressing views because I don't know what the environment is, or if someone's going to take offense. And, I'm often going to have to like be in positions where I defend or don't defend Donald Trump. And, it's just uncomfortable. And so I think that would largely account for why conservatives might be less likely to join groups like that.
Sorry, Christopher, but just so you know, I mean, when I was trying to recruit people, the main thing that a conservative person would say is, I don't want to be called stupid. I don't want to be, I don't want to be yelled at by you liberals. So I get that point. But I do want to sort of tease out the fact that I was thinking more about, like, in my experience of in this world, like, conservatives aren't organizing the conversations as much. So I get why they don't want to participate if I organize it, but they're not being proactive about it as much, as far as I can tell. And I'm not, it's not a blame thing. It's just an observation that I see that I would hope to be different. And, anyway, so I'm sorry, Christopher, go ahead.
No, and I was just going to say, and this is again only anecdotal evidence, but I was surprised by the overwhelming interest in our project on the conservative side. I mean, one of the best attended events we did in the first couple of weeks was at the Manhattan Institute, which of course is a particular kind of conservative group, and we did podcasts for the American Burkean and kind of all over the place. And so again, it's not necessarily directly related to your experience or what you're driving at here, but I was impressed by the fact that it wasn't just liberals saying, "Oh, we would love to figure out a way to talk to the mysterious Trump voter." It was conservatives saying, how can we all come together? How can we take this temperature down a little bit? And I think that there's something to that. I mean, I think in the conservative ethos, as I've come to know it through Jordan's eyes, there is something to like bringing us all together as a country. I mean, that is like deeply ingrained in our American tradition. And so I think it's a very conservative thing to want to talk civilly once again. And we've been finding there is that interest out there. But again, anecdotal, we're only seeing a certain segment of the population.
Yeah, well, so I think that's true. And I guess the one thing I'd add is, I think a lot of the impetus over the last 4 years for some of these conversations probably stems in part from the big surprise that Democrats faced in 2016 when Donald Trump did win, and it seemed like we clearly just don't understand what this large section of America believes or feels. It's why Hillbilly Elegy was so popular, because it sort of gave insight into this like Appalachian culture that somehow supports the president, even though maybe for decades they supported Democrats. And so I think it was that surprise that led a lot of people to wonder, like, well, we need to have more conversation. We need to meet people more. And I think that surprise was not as strong on the right. It maybe was at sort of the sort of upper levels of the Republican establishment, but among the broader base, I don't think it was there. So that probably also explains in part the difference in initiative.
Yeah, I think that's right. Stephen Maxwell asks a question that I was actually going to ask earlier and I got sidetracked. Stephen, we did actually talk about, the privilege of two white men driving around the country. Like, it's a lot easier for them to do that. But the thing that I wanted to draw out that I wanted to go back to, I forgot, is that you are white. And that does make a difference. When I've driven around, like, I'm super aware of the fact that I'll go into places and I'm the only person of color in the room, and usually it's fine. But, I hate that I have to like think about that. And it's very disconcerting. And every once in a while I'll come across something that, is not very pleasant to deal with, but most of the time it's fine. But gosh, I was just thinking about, back in the days, when Black people actually had to have their own guidebook to show what hotels they were allowed to stay in, where it was safe to travel through. I don't know. I think it's worth acknowledging that it's not just your maleness, it's your whiteness that allowed you to be able to just drive around and not even think about it. And I think about that, and you did address that a little bit when you were pulled over by the cop at the very beginning. Christopher, you were very disconcerted and for whatever, can you talk a little bit about your discomfort there and also about this sort of larger question?
Yeah, absolutely. So the story there is that we were driving through Idaho and I was going a little bit fast. I was in the driver's seat and we got pulled over. And this officer proceeded to ask us very normal questions, can I see your license and can I see your registration, et cetera, et cetera. And to make a long story short, our answers just didn't make any sense to this guy. The fact that I was from Berkeley and Jordan was from Los Angeles. We were both in Connecticut. The car was registered to an address in New York. We were driving to California together. Jordan was doing 2 degrees. I had become just that everything about our background just sort of spoke to something being off, and maybe there being vice involved in this in this interaction. And I was pretty petrified throughout the entire experience, in large part because I had had less than positive experiences with the police growing up in the Bay Area. And I'd also been, I read a lot about the Black Panthers, who were founded just down the street from where I grew up. And I knew the history of, the Oakland PD and others in the Bay Area. And so I was terrified. But Jordan came at this interaction with very different priors. He had served next to a bunch of people who had gone on to become police officers, or who were, he knew police officers in some ways. They felt sort of very, very akin to his sort of, Marine service in some ways. I'll let him expand on that, but he wasn't so worried, and he found my concern kind of laughable, for good reason, from his experience. And that trigger, this man eventually let us go because we were just saying the right story. There was no vice going on. He was kind about the speeding ticket, but it prompted this conversation that Jordan and I had about how this stop might have gone differently if we looked different, if we were people of color, or if our gender was different, or if Jordan hadn't served in the Marines, even something as small as that. I mean, that is in large part why this officer eventually let us go without the ticket, is that Jordan expressed, I'm a Marine, and I wouldn't allow anything to be going on in my car in this way. And that was a language that this officer spoke and understood and respected, and he let us go about our way. And so yeah, I mean, we were painfully aware of how our privilege on the road and the ways in which things might look very, very different if we looked different out there. But I will say that one of the biggest messages of this book is hope. That there is hope for our future, that America can aspire to our better angels. We can be good. We have been good. We can be good. And that is not our message per se. I mean, this is part memoir, and this is also part reportage. And the message of hope comes from the people we met. And the people we met were a diverse group of people. People who are returning citizens and women, men, blue collar, white collar, pretty much people of color. I mean, pretty much everyone. And the message of hope really came out of Tulsa, where we spent time engaging with this very, very difficult history. This is a very segregated city with a race massacre, the 1921 race massacre in its past. And it was the people on the ground there that taught us this message of hope. And so in that way, like, the message of this book is not necessarily ours. It is in part ours, but it is in large part the journalistic endeavor, which is bringing back the voices that were speaking this hope. So, you can discount our experience somewhat, but really the core of this message is not necessarily even ours. We are just happen to be a vessel in this way. But Jordan, does that capture how you feel about this?
Yeah, I think you captured it really nicely.
We're a little bit over time, and so I do want to end on a message of hope. And in fact, I highlighted a section about that too, because again, I think you really captured it. And before I read this, though, I want to acknowledge that it's how hard it is, and some of the most aggressive criticisms of the work that I've been doing were coming from my side, from the lefties on my own side. And so it's just really hard. So I just want to acknowledge that. I know it's really difficult. One of our questions, the person just is so disgusted with our conversation that she left. And I'm really sorry that she left, because I get it. Like, it's a dramatic world out there, and we're not, we're giving a very sunny sort of view of it. But I do feel this hope. I do feel this optimism. And I want to share that with others, because we have a lot to be thankful for, and we have a lot to be hopeful for. So I'm just going to stop talking and if you don't mind, I'm reading from your book to you. But I think it's really great. I really love what you wrote. In this part, Jordan says, optimism is the belief that things are changing for the better, which I totally agree with. Hope is the belief that together we can change things for the better. This made sense to us. Optimism is based on faith about what the future will hold. Hope recognizes things as they are, but also how they could be if we act together to make it so. Hope is neither naive nor blind. It requires courage, resilience, patience. To have hope is to see what has gone wrong and to believe in what can go right. And I think, I wish Kimberly were here, because we're not saying that there aren't problems in the world. There's a lot of messed up things in the world right now that we need to address, but we're not going to address them unless we actually talk to each other and work together. And so I hope she comes back to the conversation. Like, how are we going to move forward if people like her leave the conversation? That's my hope, that we all engage with each other. Do you all want to just end with some final thoughts?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. This was so much fun. I think your insights are just incredible, and your activities and experiences is amazing. So Chris and I are just very grateful to be able to have this conversation with you. And thank you for reading what are actually my two favorite passages. So thank you so much for doing that.
Yeah, I would just echo everything Jordan said. Thank you so much for this conversation, and I hope someday we'll be able to maybe get an invite to one of those dinners, because it sounds like it's a magnificent project that, and Jordan, I agree with you. We hope people will engage, and I hope today was hopefully a decent argument for why.
Well, maybe we'll go to Jazz Fest. We'll meet up in Jazz Fest one day.
Amen.
That would be amazing. Yeah. Well, thank you both. I loved your book. I loved this conversation and all the questions. Thank you, audience. And thank you, NYU. This was so just terrific. And I really hope we can do more of this. So let's get out there and talk to people.
Well, thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.